I want to show how the Christ-centered model for early Genesis can be used to help answer even the toughest apologetics questions. And what I want is for pastors, teachers, apologists, evangelists to consider the Christ-centered model because it's true, but also because it's helpful in apologetics, and it's helpful because it is true. And so what are the most difficult apologetics questions? I think the massacre of the Amalekites probably qualifies as one of the greatest challenges for apologists, because the Lord ordered this tribe, and I think probably that's what it was. Amalek was a grandson of Esau, and so he and his clan or his tribe wandered around the desert. So I don't know if genocide is the right word, because it wasn't the end of the whole people. I mean, they were related to the Edomites. And they were related to the Israelites too. As a matter of fact, if you go back not too far, if you just go back 500 years or so before these events take place. So it wasn't a genocide, but it was a big massacre. And God said, kill the women, kill the children, kill the livestock. And then this distinguishes from other situations in the Old Testament where this happens, but Saul spares the king of the Amalekites, and he spares some of the best of the livestock, and he says, well, I'll sacrifice these to the Lord. And the Lord didn't want that sacrifice. He wanted them disposed of and away from the people, and this led to the Lord rejecting Saul as king. Saul was going too easy on them because the Lord said, I've devoted these people to destruction. I devoted the animals to destruction, and you spared the king, and you spared the choicest of the livestock. So that sounds like, wow, that's pretty hardcore, Mark. How can you defend this? How can you defend such a bloodlust? And I think, especially even in comparison to the other things in the Old Testament, this is why the atheists and the people who try to let themselves off the hook from being accountable to God, who want to say, well, I'm more moral than the God of the Old Testament because I don't believe in genocide. And again, it wasn't genocide. It was too small a group for that. But how do you justify such a thing? It's not like in the other incidents, like in the city of Jericho. Yeah, they were supposed to surround the city, wipe out the city. But in truth, what happened was they sent spies in, and if they found somebody worthy, and you didn't have to be too worthy. The people they saved were Rahab and her family, and she was a prostitute. But they found a way to preserve them. So typically what would happen is, yeah, the city is devoted to destruction, but if there's someone in there that is worthy or has faith or is willing to identify with the people of Israel, they got spared. So the destruction was less complete than the general order would suggest. And that's consistent with God's nature all the way back to Abraham. When Abraham had this talk with God, God says, I'm going to wipe out Sodom and Gomorrah. It's too late for them. They've gone too rotten. And he says, well, what if there's 50 righteous people in it? You wouldn't destroy a city with 50 righteous people in it. And he's like, no, I'll spare it if I find 50. And Abraham talks him down to 10. And he says, well, I'll spare the city if there are 10 righteous in it. And that is kind of consistent with the rest of the conquest. Even though they're supposed to wipe out these cities, it really, if there's some righteous in there, they get them out first. But that wasn't the case here. This is the clearest example where the Lord is like, these people have got to go. From top to bottom, they've got to go. Man, woman, child, they've got to go. How do you defend something like that? Okay. Let's step back first and look at the bigger picture that we are not God and what he knows and what we don't know. God said to Abraham way back when he started this process, when he said, you're going to own all this land. And the land was full of Canaanites at the time. The land was full of the different versions of the Canaanites, like the Amorites. And he said to Abraham, you're not going to get it yet. Your descendants are going to get it hundreds of years from now, because the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. Now, what does that mean? It means God knows the future. He knows the point at which there will be no one in that culture left that can be redeemed. There will be no one left in that culture that will bring a positive good to the world. He knows that. And he knew that they were not there yet. But we don't know. We don't know if a child, even if they're from bad blood, bad family, or whatever, we don't know if they'll grow up to be a mass murderer that takes many lives or a doctor who saves many lives. We don't know that. We can make some educated guesses, but God can do more than that. And besides that, God is the giver of life. He and the decider of our eternal fate. So he knows what person is going to be like, and he gave them their life. He gave to be the steward, by the way, not the owner, but the steward of their life. And so it's not like a worldly ruler. A worldly ruler, when they order a genocide, when they order a massacre, when they start a war, they are taking from people what they did not give people. They did not give people their life, but they're taking their lives. That's unjust. God, who is the giver of life, he is the assigner of life. He knows what their future outcome will be. And I've got other videos where I said, there's certain situations in which the Lord can step out of his all-knowingness, and I argue that he did this to God the Son through much of the Old Testament. But that doesn't mean he can't know specifics about what this people will be like, what their future will be like, what things will be like if this people is permitted to continue. So, for example, I think one time they asked Jeb Bush, a presidential candidate in his own mind, I think, a brother of and son of a president, if you could go back in time and strangle baby Hitler, would you do it? And it was a setup question. He never should have answered it, but he wasn't very good as a politician. Maybe that's to his credit, I don't know. But he said, "Oh yeah, I would. I'd go back in time and strangle baby Hitler." And I think it's understood that if you could stop World War II and all that bloodshed and the Holocaust and all the horrors that came from the war, that justified strangling a baby if you knew who that baby was going to be. I think there are people in America, some of the same ones maybe that think they're more moral than God because of this very thing of the massacre of the Amalekites. They use that as an example. I think they'd go back in time and strangle a baby Donald Trump. Not just a baby Hitler, but a baby Trump. I think when the shoe is on the other foot, they understand the argument of, if we let this person live, we know they will cause more harm because we know the future than if we don't let them live. So the moral action is to kill them to save many. And that's the decision. Just like it's what policemen have to make these decisions all the time. A killer has a knife at someone's throat, and they've got a chance to take the shot and take them out, and they take them out. And they make the decision that it's better to take that person's life than let them live, and all the harm they can do in society would continue. So we don't know that calculus. Human rulers do not know that calculus. They can stir up hate and animosity towards one group against another, but they don't know the future like God knows, and they didn't give the life. Okay, so that is one aspect of it. But I want to go all the way back earlier in Genesis, go back even to the flood, and how the Christ-centered model, you understand it differently. And the Christ-centered model, it is a local flood with global consequences. Okay, and I want to use this to show how the Christ-centered model helps with apologetics, and it's going to help with the Amalekites too. But first, let's start with a principle. God was wiping out the line of Adam. He had the line of Adam, and there were other people outside the garden in the Christ-centered model, but he wiped out the line of Adam because that was the line that the Messiah was supposed to come through. That was the point of Adam. God was initiating this plan to bring creation to himself. And they'd gone bad. They were bringing the world down. They were like the original Dr. Frankenstein novel. Dr. Frankenstein is not criticized for trying to stop his monster once he realized he created a monster. He's criticized for trying to play God, which obviously is a charge that does not apply against God himself. So that is what the Lord had to do. I've formed Adam, and the Lord here is God the Son interacting in the world. I formed Adam. The line is going bad. They're bringing creation down with them. I've got to wipe them out. And the Father realizing, well, this what does this do to all creation? It means the Messiah never comes. It means atonement never occurs. It means the entire world will go to ruin. The whole world will go to ruin because it will never be redeemed. Christ will never come because here's the divine instrument, and God's plan would then be interrupted by human sin. And so he makes provision to save Noah, to save some of the other works from chapter 2 so they can be preserved through the flood. He uses it to point to baptism, ties it right into the new covenant, and works out beautifully when you understand the story properly, which unfortunately most Christians do not because they just took the Jewish version of the event. And you can't, Moses wrote about Christ, and if you take a version of it from someone who doesn't make it about Christ and put him in the center, it's not the real message of the text. So they don't get what it's really saying. And so they lose these debates. They lose these apologetics arguments all the time because they're trying to defend a Christless or a non-Christ-centered view of the text. But here's what I'm getting to. Amalek had opposed Israel from the start. When they came out from the Exodus, hungry, thirsty, tired, Amalek ambushed them, get all the stragglers, killed them, sold them into slavery, plundered them. They were a nomadic people, so they went to all the nearby nations, and they constantly were trying to stir up alliances against Israel. They were trying to bring Israel down in every way they could. They plundered Israel. They opposed it, so much so that it's kind of a nickname for a implacable enemy of Israel. Amalek is a nickname for an implacable enemy of Israel, even among the Jews today. So I could argue on that, on one case, that God knew, just like with some of the Canaanites, it was too late. He knew at what point they became irredeemable as a people. And he knew even more what the threat was in the future from Amalek. To what? To what? To God's plan to have his people, Israel, be that nation, be his people, and be a receptacle or a conduit for the world to receive Messiah. And that was God's plan. And if he could just get them to there, then he would incarnate and he would do the work. He would do the rest. But he had his plan. He had this people, and it wasn't going well. They were being seduced. They were being led astray. They were turning aside to other gods. They weren't doing well. And he could see a future threat to his plan to redeem mankind, just like the flood was. The flood had to be done because they had gone bad and you needed a restart. But if it had been a total elimination of the line of Messiah, God's plan for humanity, centered on redemption, would be wiped out. And so the human race, the world would perish. It would never be redeemed. All the good things that faith has brought into this world, which include, by the way, political liberty and scientific progress, even if many people want to deny that as well as many other facts. But was there a threat to this plan through Amalek? We don't know. But who does know? God knows. All right? So it was even more of a moral imperative than you don't have to strangle a baby Hitler, but anyway you killed a baby Hitler, to stop World War II from coming. And there could have been some other leader arise, and the same demagogic way that he took advantage of that, some other leader could have. That other leader might have been a little more stable and even a bigger threat. So we don't know that strangling baby Hitler would even have stopped World War II or would have stopped the Holocaust or anything like that. But God knew. God knew that the Amalekites needed to be taken out of the way because they were implacable enemies of Israel, and they were a threat to him taking Israel along until Messiah could come and redeem the world. And honestly, even with interventions like this, they barely staggered across the finish line. They weren't much of a people then. He had to put them under Roman authority. He had to put them under a foreign authority. They were the people who had taken over the Jewish faith were hypocrites and wicked in their heart, but outwardly righteous. So they were religious jerks, basically, and unjust people. So they barely staggered across the finish line, even as it was, even with the Lord trying to manage their history so that they wouldn't be wiped out and they wouldn't be seduced to turn aside. And even with his interventions, they barely staggered to the finish line. Maybe he wiped out as few people as necessary to get there. It's not like they crossed the finish line and won by a mile and fulfilled God's plan to be a light to the nations, and all the world looked to them. And then their king would come, and they would acknowledge that he was from heaven, and he would be an honored sacrifice instead of a despised one. It's not like that they did that plan. They did everything they could to undermine God's plan. God still pulled it off in spite of them, but just barely. So, in conclusion, you guys do not know enough to make the accusations you're making, and the other evidence shows that he is not that kind of God. And really, I feel for you even making such accusations that you can't know are true. You can't know that, there's no way in which genocide is justified. Really? What if Amalek had survived, all of Israel would have been genocided? It's almost happened a couple of times anyway. What if it had happened? What if you had to kill the Amalekites to keep, which is just a tribe, to keep Israel from being massacred in an alliance of these other kingdoms a little bit later on? Does that change the moral picture? I think it does. But that's nothing compared to what the Christ-centered model brings to this. Because if Israel had been wiped out, what does that mean for us? What does that mean for mankind? What does that mean for the whole earth? It means Messiah does not come. We are not redeemed, and we perish. So, God was justified in ordering the extermination of the Amalekites because he's God, because he knows. We don't know. Our hearts aren't right. His heart is right. He knows the big picture, and we don't. It's really a question of whether you have faith or not. As it so often happens, it comes down to faith. You cannot please God without faith. If you're going to be an accuser, if you're going to be a doubter, if you're going to assume the worst possible connotations of every word and every action of God, then you cannot please him. Thank you so much for listening, and may God bless.